That is on already, right? Yeah, okay. All right, let's begin. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about anything so far? All right, let me resume my narrative from where I had stopped. You might recall that the last thing I had talked to you about was identity, right? And I was giving you an account whereby I was suggesting to you that before we start to unravel the problem of Hindu-Muslim relations in India, or rather I should say the problem of communalism, because Hindu-Muslim relations do not always lead to problems. In fact, by and large, Hindus and Muslims navigate the terrain. They live in that society together and have various kinds of interactions. And as I've explained to you on numerous occasions before, there are certainly some domains of life in which that interaction is rather limited. If you're looking, for example, at things like intermarriages, I think it would be safe to say that the rate of intermarriage between Hindus and Muslims is very, very low. I think that there are intellectual circles of a certain kind where interaction between Hindus and Muslims is rather minimal, right? But on the whole, Hindu-Muslim relations have to be understood as part of the fabric of that society, a fabric that has been stitched over a very long period of time, right? We're going to look very briefly at the history of Islam in India, because that's going to be the backdrop. But the principal subject for today's lecture is communalism, the problem of communalism. And the problem of communalism can only be understood if, as I submitted to you last time, we understand the question of identity. What really constitutes identity? What is it that makes Hindus all congeal together towards something called Hindu identity? Is that the case at all to begin with? And what is this thing called Hindu identity versus Muslim identity? And why should these two blocks of identity, if I may put it this way, why should that lead to some kind of conflict? Okay. So let's begin with the story of Ayodhya. I mean, there are two ways of doing it. One is to tackle it sort of theoretically, historiographically, and then give you the example of Ayodhya, or to begin, which is what I'm going to do today, because in fact in my last lecture I really sort of started in a kind of in a broader theoretical way about how we might look at the question of identity. So today we're going to take the opposite strategy. We're going to look at a particular problem that arose in India in recent years. You have a long article written by myself as part of the reading on what happened at Ayodhya. So what is Ayodhya? That's the last item here on the board here. Ayodhya is the name of a town in North India, and some Hindus will argue that Ayodhya has been, if I may put it to you this way, a sacred site for a very long period of time. And very long here means for centuries, going back, in fact, into remote antiquity. Okay. Now, Ayodhya is mentioned in some of the ancient texts as a pilgrimage site. So this is a place where pilgrims would come to. But there are dozens of other places which are mentioned in the Indian epics and texts as well as pilgrimage sites, right? So the question is, was there something spectacularly different about Ayodhya or not? Okay. Now, in the 16th century, in the city of Ayodhya, a mosque is built. It's called the Babri Masjid. Okay, the Babri Masjid. And the Babri Masjid was built at the orders or at the command of the Mughal Emperor Babur. Okay. So I want you to just keep this in mind. I'm going to have to now get a little bit into the history of the coming of Islam into India, just a little bit, just so that you have the backdrop. We don't really want to spend too much time on it because, I mean, that's a subject in itself. The history of Islam in India, how it got established, so forth and so on. And the history I'm giving you is not, accurate in every detail, because I'm going to have to really, as I said, press into details in order to give you a complete sense of it. But the way you can look at it is that Islam comes to India essentially several decades after Islam arose in West Asia. okay, right? That is after the birth of the Prophet, right? And we know that Islam is going to spread pretty rapidly, right? So we have Islam coming to India, to the western part of India, okay, not too long after the death of the Prophet, just a few decades really, in a sense. But it's not really established at that part, in that part of the country at that time. The real establishment of Islam in a fundamental sense really takes place, okay, roughly around 1000 AD. And the Hindu view for a very long period of time has been that Islam came as a religion of conquest, okay? It came as a religion of conquest. And so if you look at the Hindu nationalist view, the Hindu nationalist view is that it did not simply come as a religion of conquest, but that in fact it came as a religion which tried to completely usurp, okay, what you may today call Hinduism, because it has also been argued, and I think that this is a correct argument, that the word Hinduism cannot really be used, strictly speaking, for people who you might think of as Hindus in the 11th century AD. Why? Because these Hindus were divided into various groups, Vaishnavas, Shaivas, Shaktos. You don't have to worry about all of these details, just try to understand the logic of the argument, right? Because when we get to Ayodhya, that's where it's going to become more important for our purposes, right? But the point is that there obviously are people living in India who are the practitioners of a religion that we today call Hinduism, and they've been living there for a very substantial period of time. And so the Hindu nationalist narrative is that Islam comes to India and establish itself as a religion of conquest, which means that it in fact actually tries to conquer the Hindus forcibly. And one of the characters or one of the historical people associated with that conquest is a man called Muhammad of Ghazni. Muhammad of Ghazni, the mention of his name in Hindu middle class households is likely to, raise their, anger, by a degree that it's hard to, even understand. Because Muhammad of Ghazni is supposed to have been this, at least according to this narrative, this brutal conqueror who came and decimated Hindu populations, pillaged the temples, destroyed them, so forth and so on. That's the narrative, okay? What is certainly very clear is that by the year 1200, roughly, a Muslim dynasty gets established in North India, okay? And there are going to be a series of dynasties, and North India is going to be under Muslim rule for a very long period of time. Not only North India, there are going to be other parts of India where the Muslim presence is going to become quite important. So what you have here in the south is what are called the Deccan Sultanates, okay? So sultanates, meaning Islamic kingdoms, right? This is going to be established later on, though, more like the 15th century, 14th, 15th century. The Delhi Sultanate is basically a series of Muslim kingdoms, right? And the extent of this is going to be pretty vast, okay? Established roughly around 1200. Now, the nature of that period from 1200 through the early 1500s, okay, so roughly 300 years that we're looking at over here, the nature of this period is under substantial interpretation and debate and discussion, right? I mean, there are different views about what exactly happened. What was the nature of relations between Hindus and Muslims, right? What percentage of the population was converted to Islam, okay? Was this population converted entirely through the use of arms, that is forcibly? People were forced to convert, because if they didn't convert, then they would be penalized either by death or by imprisonment or by fines, whatever the case may be, right? This is something that is disputed, and there are different views. So for example, there is one view which argues that the coming of Islam to India was facilitated by the presence of Sufi preachers. So who are the Sufis? The Sufis are these Islamic preachers who preach a much softer version of Islam. Okay, they're not interested in imposing the Sharia. The Sharia is Islamic law. They're not interested in imposing that. Sufi mystics and Hindu mystics are supposed to have a great deal in common, for example. And so the argument is that Islam became attractive to some of the people living in India because it came as a religion of love. It came as preeminently a religion of equality. That's the main argument that is used, right? That this is what made Islam attractive, right? And why equality? Because in principle, Islam does not recognize the presence of something called caste. There's no caste system in Islam, right? That's the argument. Now, there are some people who take a completely different view and say, oh, that's a very generous interpretation of the coming of Islam and establishment of Islam to India, okay? Right? It's a very generous interpretation because we can show that Muslims were people who were formerly Hindus, and these people were forcibly converted. And they were forcibly converted and they could not resist because North India, after 1200, comes under Muslim rule. Right? So, in fact, in other words, Islam is now the state religion. But then again, you say, well, what does it mean to call it a state religion? Does it mean that the Sharia was imposed? Okay? Right? And you know that what the imposition of Sharia means. I hope that some of you at least read one of the links that I sent to you in an email about 8-10 days ago. You might remember reading this article that came in the New York Times that, you know, in a certain portion of Afghanistan, Karzai, the president, signed into law. Well, strictly speaking, by the way, he didn't sign it into law, but let's not worry about the technicalities right now. That basically there's a piece of legislation that was approved, which is part of the Sharia here, which makes it mandatory for a woman to submit sexually to her husband whenever he wants it. Right? I don't know if you read that article that came out. It was a huge hue and cry over it. Okay? Right? So we're not saying, by the way, that all of that is Sharia, and we're not even saying that that is part of Sharia, but that is how it came across. Okay, so the Sharia is the imposition of Islamic law, and so one view is that Islam became the dominant religion of North India, okay, and therefore it led to the imposition of the Sharia. And even if it did not lead to the imposition of the Sharia, what it certainly means is that Hindus were no longer sovereign, and therefore some of these people were forcibly converted. Right? And that's how the number of Muslims in India substantially grew. Okay? Now, we are not here to resolve that dispute at the present moment. My own personal view of the matter is, and I think I've made that clear to you right at the outset of the class, and I've mentioned a number of times, that I think what happened in India is the development of what I have called an Indo-Islamic synthesis. Okay, an Indo-Islamic synthesis that in fact what developed in North India especially was a culture which borrowed liberally from Islamic elements, added to the superstructure that you already had in India before, okay, and developed a culture which partook both of Islam and non-Islamic elements. Okay, and you can see that very clearly in architecture. You can see that in other facets of life. Right? That's the view that basically I have espoused. Right? But as I said, this is not something that we're going to be able to resolve necessarily to everybody's satisfaction. Right? And because there are lots of detailed questions, such as the assumption that Sharia was imposed. There are Orthodox Muslim theologians in the 14th century who bitterly complain about the fact that even though India is now an Islamic state, okay, Darul Islam, under the rule of Islam, that even though India is under the rule of Islam, that Sharia is not being imposed. This is a complaint being made by Orthodox Muslim theologians. So then, in other words, the Muslim theologians who take the view in the 14th century that, well, actually, India is only nominally under Muslim rule. That is, there are Muslim rulers here, but they're not really ruling like Muslim rulers, you know. Right? So we're going to continue to have that kind of, it seems to me, discussion and debate. Now, shortly after the 1500s, I mean, the Delhi Sultanate is going to disappear into the mist of history, if I may put it this way. And what's going to come into its place, except that this is going to be a much vaster empire, going to encompass large parts of North India, South India, what is today called Pakistan, portions of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, what is today Bangladesh. It's all going to come under the rule of the Mughal Empire. Okay, so the Mughal Empire, which gets established in India in 1526. Some historians have argued that it is the greatest empire of the day. okay, equivalent to anywhere in the world. And I think that that's a plausible argument, but again, we need not worry too much about it. The idea of that remark is simply to indicate to you that this is an empire that is enormous in its reach. But it's not simply the size of the empire, it is the achievements of the empire that matter, right? What kind of synthesis developed? Who were the Mughal rulers? You know, so you can get into these cliched stories constantly, and some of the cliches have value, right? So if you read Amartya Sen's, you know, The Argumentative Indian, which is a book that has been assigned to you, or portions of it that have been assigned. So there are other portions of the book which talk about the Mughals in India. And so one of the great Mughal emperors was a man called Akbar. Akbar is very often mentioned as a routine example of a Mughal emperor, a Muslim ruler, in other words, who married a Hindu woman, for example. Okay? And never imposed Sharia. Never imposed Sharia. In fact, had a court where it is very clear he relied upon Hindu ministers as much as he did upon anybody else, right? Okay, so that would be taken as an illustration of the kind of, if I may put it this way, harmony that existed between the Hindus and Muslims. And, you know, you could say that there's a little bit of a problem of a sort that we'd have to iron out here, which is that how do we extrapolate from what happened at the top level, okay? How do we extrapolate from there to what happened at the bottommost level of Indian society? That is, that if there was a kind of a cultural synthesis which was taking place in the court of the Mughal emperor, where Hindus and Muslims and others, you know, all sat down together for conversations. One of the things that Akbar is really famous for is trying to create a new faith, a new religion. It's called the Din-e-Ilahi. Okay, and what was his new religion going to be? Deen. Deen is faith. Din-e-Ilahi, it was going to be a religion which was going to take elements from Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, all the religions that were prevalent in India, right? So this is very often mentioned as a sign of how ecumenical, how tolerant a ruler he was. And I'm saying to you, all right, maybe that narrative is completely true, but what inferences can we make about whether this kind of mixing and tolerance was taking place at all levels of Indian society? Was it only taking place at the court, where Akbar didn't have to pay any price for it, you could say? But what about at the middle levels, the lower levels of Indian society? Can we make that inference or not? Okay, so this is, you can see, where we get into complexities of interpretation. How do we know about what is really happening? Are Hindus and Muslims mixing together, you know, in everyday life? Okay, right? Are they eating together? Do they share their festivals together? Do they have shared conversations in common? Right? I think these are all the kinds of considerations that become important. So keep that in mind now. Now let's go back to the story of Babur. So Babur is the person who is going to establish the Mughal Empire in 1526 in India. Okay, the creator of the Mughal Empire. And by the way, who are these people? The Babur and his descendants and the nobility, they are not Indian Muslims. These are not people who were Hindus who have been converted to Islam. They're coming from Turkey. They're coming from some of the, you know, the Delhi Sultanate as well. Some of these people are Afghans, principally Afghans, coming from Afghanistan, right? Some of them are coming from Central Asia. So the nobility, the people who, the Muslims, aristocrats, a lot of these people, they are not in fact indigenous to India. They're coming from outside. So what we have here is, we have the establishment of this empire, 1526. Now Babur orders a mosque to be built. It is called the Babri Masjid, named after him, you could say. Babri Masjid. Masjid is mosque. Okay? And this mosque is built 1520s, 1530s. It stands until its destruction in 1992. It's destroyed in 1992. So it stands for well over 450 years. Okay? Now, we don't have time to look at what happens in all these intervening 450 years, obviously. But we have to look at one or two central parts of that narrative. Okay? One or two central parts of that narrative. And the central part of that narrative, of those 450 years, that is of concern to us, is the coming of the British to India. The coming of the British to India. and how they interpret the Indian past, and what is their understanding of the relations that had existed between Hindus and Muslims in India. And you've all heard this phrase, okay? And here again, this is a cliched phrase, but by sheer virtue of the fact that it's a cliche doesn't mean that we should completely ignore it or dismiss it, and that is, what is the imperial policy? The imperial policy is divide and rule, right? That's very often how the history of imperialism has been written, that imperial power comes into a certain domain, and it understands that one of the most effective ways in which it can exercise its sovereignty is to divide the opposition, ensure that the opposition never comes about, right? So in other words, assuming that there was a harmonious relationship between Hindus and Muslims, according to this narrative, the British were interested in fomenting divisions between the two, in fomenting hatred, if you want to put it a much stronger way, but certainly fomenting divisions, creating divisions between the two, because if you could get the Hindus and the Muslims obviously to disagree with each other, the likelihood that they would come together to forge some kind of common opposition to the British is going to be considerably diminished, right? And it stands to reason that they should have done that. I mean, this is a logical argument in many ways, right? But of course, you have to accept the hypothesis that Hindus and Muslims had created, in fact, a kind of a common culture between themselves, which the British then sought to divide or destruct, right? And so this is why the interpretation of what happened before the coming of the British becomes, in some ways, quite crucial, okay? Right? Now, let's put in a second element into that discussion of what happens in these years. The second element, that is these intervening years between the time that the mosque is built, because there is no question, by the way, nobody disputes that the mosque was built. That's not disputed. There was a huge dispute about what to do with the Babri Masjid, but the dispute is not about whether the mosque was built or not, and at whose orders it was built. The mosque is there, right? Or it was there before it was destroyed on 6 December 1992. The dispute had to do with a number of other things. And this is where the second element comes in. Let me tell you the dispute, and then I'll go back to the second element, okay? In the 1980s, now by this time you know that one of the things that had happened in India, in post-independent India, was, you know, that the Congress party was a dominant party, right? So Jawaharlal Nehru is a prime minister. Eventually, after his death, there's a gap of 1 or 2 years when Lal Bahadur Shastri is going to be the prime minister. Then his daughter is going to become the prime minister. And the commonly accepted view is that the Congress party was in principle committed to secularism. It was a secular party. It was not a Hindu nationalist party in principle. But that does not mean that the Congress did not exploit religion when it thought that this exploitation of religion might serve its purposes, right? That's a different thing. But that in principle, it's a secularist party, right? And it may have an instrumental conception of religion, which it then deploys at certain times. Now, following the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in January 1948, one of the consequences was that the Indian government basically banished the Hindu nationalists into exile, if I may put it this way. That is that the Hindu nationalist parties were told that you cannot operate in the realm of politics because you are, in fact, responsible for the death, for the assassination of the father of the nation. So they're banished, they're outlawed. And even when the ban on these parties are lifted, it is very clear that they do not command any kind of legitimacy in the Indian population at large. But one of the things we have seen in this narrative is that by the 1970s, a certain kind of despondency and despair has set in. You remember the whole JP movement. What was that about? Dissatisfaction with where India was going, the fact that there was very little growth in the country, unrest. And basically, if I may put it this way, it's a backdoor for the Hindu nationalists to come back into politics. The wars with Pakistan probably also gave encouragement to the Hindu nationalists, because when you have a war, it always stirs up nationalist sentiment, right? And that's true all over the world. So what we're saying is that the Hindu nationalists are looking for a chance to enter into Indian politics, get back into Indian politics. By the 1980s, they're able to do that. One of the hooks on which they staked everything, you hang something on a hook, right? What is that hook on which you're going to hang your life, your argument? That is the cause of what is called the Ram Janam Sthan. Okay? Now, what is a Ram Janam Sthan? And what is its relationship to everything that we've talked about before? It's all going to come together in a few minutes. Okay? In the city of Ayodhya, remember I started out with Ayodhya, there's this mosque built, right, called the Babri Masjid, right, built in the 1520s, 1530s. Now, the Hindu nationalists in the early 1980s are beginning to claim, they're going to make a claim. The claim is that this mosque was built by destroying a Hindu temple that existed on that exact same spot. So that this is not just a mosque that was built and just anywhere, it was built by destroying a Hindu temple that stood on that spot. And if you said, well, why would you want to do that? Well, it's quite obvious. One of the ways in which a conqueror establishes his conquest over a people is to destroy their monuments and to build something in its place. That is not, by the way, the story just of India. That's the story of everywhere in the world. I mean, there's a famous church in Istanbul, mosque church. Depending on whether the Christians and the Muslims were in power and who was in power and when, it would become a mosque, it would become a church, goes back and forth. That's not an unusual story at all. In fact, there is a wonderful word in the English language which is not used very often. It's called spoliage. Okay? And what is spoliage basically? Right? That when you build, for example, a temple or a mosque, right? Like, for example, when the Babri Masjid was built, let's supposing there was a Hindu temple that stood on that spot. Okay? So when you destroy that Hindu temple, you've got all the stone and rubble, right? Do you just throw it away, or do you use some of that to build the mosque? You use some of it. Right? That's spoliage. In fact, all of history is spoliage. You use elements from the past to construct something new, if I may put it this way, right? So the Hindu nationalists are claiming that a temple stood on that spot and it was destroyed to make room for this mosque. So then somebody comes along and says, I've got a little bit problem here, another problem now with that interpretation. And that problem is, so what? Isn't it true that thousands of mosques were built that way? What's so special about this one? What's so special about this temple that was destroyed? Aren't temples destroyed over a long period of Indian history? Hasn't it been the case that religious monuments have crumbled, been destroyed, and then new ones come up in their place, right? And so then the Hindu nationalists say, but this is not just any temple. Yes, it is true that India is a land of millions of temples. In fact, Ayodhya, by the way, is said to have over 10,000 temples. And it's not the size of Delhi or Bombay that we're talking about here. We're not talking about a huge metropolis, We're talking about a relatively small town. It's said to have 10,000 temples, right? Of course, Hinduism is also said to have 330 million gods and goddesses. Nobody's tried to count them, right? So yeah, 10,000 temples. It certainly has tons of temples, though. No question about that. If you go to Ayodhya, they're all over the place. That's true of a lot of these cities, okay? So what's so special about this one? What's special is the fact, according to the Hindu nationalists, that this temple, the Hindu temple that was there, had been built by the Hindus to mark the place where the god Ram was born. So Ram Janam Sthan means, Sthan is place, like in Pakistan, right? Turkmenistan, same ending. Okay, so Sthan, place, Janam, birth, Ram. The place of the birth of Ram. And Ram is not just any Indian god. He's one of the principal Hindu gods. You can see how the story is coming together now, right? Because now the claim is that the Babri Masjid was built by destroying a Hindu temple built at the most sacred site of the Hindus. And so what is the demand? Because then the question is, okay, let's accept all of this up till this point in time. So what do the Hindu nationalists want? What did the Hindu nationalists want? They wanted the Babri Masjid to be destroyed, because the Babri Masjid was a sign of the submission of the Hindus to the Muslims. And it was something that was intolerable. It was a sign of the brutal conquest of Islam over a Hindu India, right? And of course, there's a softer version of that demand. The softer version was, destroyed is an ugly word. You know, you don't want to keep on going around if you're a political party and say, we want to destroy this mosque. Obviously, they didn't say, we want to destroy this mosque. They said, we want the mosque removed. And of course, then the Muslim theologians came along and said, you can't do that. Once a mosque has been built, it's there for good. This is the desecration of a mosque. And then, of course, there was this debate, and some people said, oh, well, so many mosques have been removed before, what's the big deal? See, at that point, it doesn't matter what the narrative is now, whether who's got the truth here. Because there are other sentiments, other passions that have entered into the conflict, in a way. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Eventually, it matters what position we take on this. But the point is that this demand is now made, and the Hindu nationalists have now found their hook. They have found a way to animate the passions of the people. And I'm not saying this was the only one. There are other issues too. One of the big issues, but we're going to leave that until we get to the whole section on women and women's rights, is what's called the Shah Bano case. If you've read the Menon Nigam book, there is a discussion of that, right? That book was assigned to you, the Shah Bano case, right? So this is one of the other things on which the Hindu nationalist movement is going to essentially drive up a storm. Okay? But as I said, leave that aside for the moment. What we have here is we have a situation where the Hindu nationalists have now found a way to enter into Indian politics. They're saying, okay, this is what happened in the Indian past, okay, and we have to now remedy this situation. Well, how can we remedy this situation? We have to essentially have this mosque removed. It has to be removed. Because so long as it is there, it is a reminder to every Hindu of his or her humiliation under Islam. Okay? And of course, the Muslims leadership was not in agreement with this demand at all, right? Now there's another group of people. So you've got the Muslim leadership, you've got the Hindu nationalist movement. There's another group of people who come into this picture. That is people like myself, at least theoretically. That is the secular, okay, intellectuals, activists, and so on. They opposed the Hindu nationalist view completely, right? And their view was, okay, let's even suppose for a second that there was in fact a temple there, because first we have to demonstrate whether there was a temple there. That's disputed, by the way. I mean, nobody disputes the fact that there's a mosque, because you can see it. But what is disputed is, was that mosque built by destroying a temple that stood at that same spot? Okay? And of course, what if there was a temple at that same spot, but had been destroyed long before Babur came there? That's also possible, right? And in fact, all kinds of theories are advanced. One scholar who's worked on this question came up with the evidence. That's an interesting argument, because you can find similar evidence of that kind elsewhere in India. And I'm not saying it's the decisive evidence, but I'm just giving an illustration of the kind of evidence that was brought up. So this scholar brought up the evidence that, yes, there was a Hindu temple there. But guess what? That Hindu temple had been built on what was the grounds of a Jaina monastery before. In other words, the Hindus actually destroyed a Jaina monastery, right? And built a temple there, right? So then the question is, well, if they did it, why can't the Muslims do it, right? But then you get into this quid pro quo kind of argument. Well, they did it, so if they did it, then therefore my doing it means nothing, right? That's a quid pro quo, right? And of course, that's not really an ethical way to argue about these kinds of issues, right? So that was not really the secular view. The secular view was not like, okay, everybody did it, so therefore it's okay. No, what they're saying is that, look, if you go back to the 16th century, we have to understand that this is the politics of conquest. In other words, it's a very subtle argument in a way, so you have to follow the distinction they're making. They're saying, okay, let's even accept everything that the Hindu nationalists are saying, for the sake of argument. They don't accept that, by the way. They don't accept that there was necessarily a temple there. But they're saying, let's hypothetically go along with what the Hindu nationalists are saying. Okay, there was a Hindu temple there. Okay? But did Babur act as a conqueror, or did he act as a Muslim? Those are two different things. In other words, that is how conquerors behaved in the 16th century. Right? They behaved that way in the 16th century, in the 15th century, 14th century. That is the politics of conquest. It has nothing to do with religion. That's what they're saying. So it's like, let me give you a different illustration of that. Okay? So Muhammad of Ghazni, remember I told you Muhammad of Ghazni comes into India, various invasions. He's said to have invaded India 17 times. Because unlike the Mughals in the 16th century, unlike Babur and others, who establish an empire, they've come to stay. But Muhammad of Ghazni is a different kind of conqueror whose idea is you come into India. Why? Because India is a land of fabulous wealth. You pillage, you steal whatever you can, you take it back with you. Then when you've exhausted your gold resources, then next year you come back with another 1,000 horsemen and attack again, if you can. Right? So he's said to have invaded India 17 times. Now one of the things that he's said to have done, he's said to have attacked, invaded, and completely destroyed the temple at Somnath. This is a Hindu temple. It was said to be fabulously wealthy. Right? So why am I raising this example? Because the secular intellectuals will say, okay, what did Muhammad of Ghazni do at Somnath? Yes, he destroyed the temple. But had there been a Bank of America in 1000 AD, they would have attacked the Bank of America. You see? If you see what I mean. In other words, you attack a temple because that's where the wealth is. It's not like Muhammad of Ghazni has some special hatred for Hindus. Okay? What he's interested in is conquest and pillage. Wherever the hoard is, that's where you go. Okay? That's where you hoard the wealth, in the temple. And they will suggest to you, by the way, and I think this can be proven by the historical record, that Muhammad of Ghazni, okay, was extremely brutal, at least as brutal towards other Muslim rulers who did not follow his rules, who did not submit to him. If he encountered another Muslim ruler on his way who opposed him, he would decimate him, just as he would decimate the Hindus. Right? So the argument here is, this has nothing to do with religion. This conflict appears to be a conflict over religion. That's how the Hindu nationalists are reading it now. They're going back to the past. They're saying, Muhammad of Ghazni was a Hindu hater. How do we know that? Because he destroyed the Somnath temple. And the secularists in the 16th century are saying, no, that's not what he was. He might just have been a hater of humankind, but at least, he didn't have any special animus towards the Hindus, right? He may not have been a hater of mankind. In fact, he might have, some of that loot is taken to build a library, by the way, in Ghazni. Muhammad of Ghazni was a great patron of the arts and learning. I mean, he built a magnificent library, right? So he had a love of books, right? And maybe he needed part of that loot for that, right? So, the people are complex. Even brutal people are complex, unlike what we think, I think. So now you can see what's happening. So we're going now to the 16th century. So the secular people are opposing the communal view. What is the communal view? So when I say secular versus communal, so the communalists are saying, and now we get to communalism and identity, right? The communalists are the Hindu nationalists here. But communalists can also be Muslim nationalists, right? They could be Sikh nationalists. But here we're looking at Hindu nationalists because they are the ones who are making this demand. The demand is, remove this mosque, okay, right? The Hindu communalists are saying, we have a certain interpretation of Indian history. And that interpretation of Indian history is an interpretation where you say that Islam and Hinduism represent two different strands of human life. Okay? They represent two different strands of life. They cannot inhabit the same place on equal terms. Where Islam is dominant, it will lead to the subjugation of Hinduism. The reverse is not true, by the way, according to the Hindu nationalists, because unlike Islam, which is an inherently intolerant faith according to the Hindu nationalists, Hinduism has always been a tolerant faith. So the reverse is not true according to the Hindu nationalist view, right? But what they are saying is that you cannot inhabit the same space. They're saying we have a different interpretation of the past. This is what is called the communal past, communal reading of Indian history. The communal reading insists that first and foremost, you interpret history through the category of religion, through the category of religion, right? So you go back to the past. When you look at these encounters, right, such as the Muhammad of Ghazni, Somnath, what do you interpret it through? You do not interpret it through the register of economics, through the question of class. No, you interpret it through the lens of religion. Okay? So from the point of view of the communalist, the foremost part of your identity, at least in India, is the religious element of your identity. Okay? And you see, that's why we had to get into this whole question of identity. What does it mean to be a Muslim, Hindu, so forth and so on? Right? That's what they're saying. And we're saying, well, where did they derive that view from? This is where you have to go to the second element that I was talking about. Right? Remember I talked about the coming of the British to India and the divide and rule. Now, it is very clear that the British are going to put into place an interpretation of Indian history which is essentially going to suggest that in India, Hinduism and Islam, or the adherents of Hinduism and the adherents of Islam, have historically speaking never been able to get along with each other. That these two religions, that their adherents are bound to be in conflict with each other. And of course, the prior element of that narrative is that when we encounter a person in India, according to the communalist reading, first and foremost, we encounter that person as a Hindu or as a Muslim, not as a male or as this or that or as a farmer or a businessman. First and foremost, it is the religious identity that is predominant. And this was, of course, a colonial view. So what we are saying is the communal view and the colonial view coincide very closely, very, very closely in many respects. And even long after the colonial ruler has left India, of course, that rule has that idea has been completely internalized. How you view the past, because what is critical to all of this is how you view the past. And therefore, what this means, okay, is that the idea of history has become the predominant way in which you try to understand the past. Okay, and you might say, well, what other way is there? Right? What other way is there? Is it not true that we always think through the category of history? And my summation to you is that, no, it's not at all true. In fact, the whole genius of Indian civilization, if I may put it this way, is precisely the fact that history was no important category at all. Right? And how do we demonstrate that? Let's look at this idea of the Ram Janamsthan, the character of Ram, and the Ram Janam Bhumi. What is, by the way, the Ram Janam Bhumi movement? You can tell the similarity of the words here. Ram Janam Bhumi, so Janam, remember birth as in Ram Janam Sthan. Bhumi is the ground, the ground. So the Ram Janam Bhumi movement, Ram Janam Bhumi movement is a movement which originates in the 1980s. And it's the movement which makes a demand that the Babri Masjid should be removed. Okay, it should be removed, right? So because the demand here, as I said, is related to a certain reading of the past. That reading of the past has to do with saying, this is the space, the exact place, Janamsthan, the exact place where Ram was born. And of course, the next element will be, we can tell you when Ram was born. Now, what is happening to Hinduism? These Hindu nationalists are beginning to historicize their religion. They're starting to view it through historical terms, historical categories, right? Why? Partly because, if I may put it this way, Hindu nationalism, I'm putting it in a very ironical way and deliberately because that's the only way to understand it. Hindu nationalism is very uncomfortable with Hindus. very, very uncomfortable with Hindus, with the idea of Hinduism. Why? Because Hindus and Hinduism are chaotic. Why are they chaotic? Because it's not an organized, rational religion in the way in which Islam is. What makes a religion rational and organized? It needs to have a definite history. It needs to have a God to whom you can ascribe a specific history. It needs to have a single book on which all believers of that faith believe in. Right? Now you start to see what are the big differences between Islam and Hinduism. Right? So if you're a Muslim, doesn't matter whether you're a Sunni or a Shia, right? The Quran is all important. It is the fundamental text. That is not the case with Hinduism. There are multiple texts. Some Hindus prefer the Bhagavad Gita, some prefer the Bhagavatam Purana, some prefer the Ramcharitmanas. There's no agreement on that. All of Islam has one single central pilgrimage place. And you're all supposed to go there as a Muslim at least once in your lifetime if you're able to do so. That's the Hajj, right? You take the pilgrimage, and where do you go? You go to Mecca. So does Hinduism have a Mecca? It does not. It does not have a Mecca. It does not have a worldwide community of people who all say, we share in one single faith. What about its gods? So we can say that, the prophet was born in year such and such. There's a complete historiography. What about the god Krishna? What about the god Ram? No Hindu for thousands of years had any interest in being able to say that Ram or Krishna were born in such and such place at such and such time. Because in fact, we don't even know whether they're historical deities. We don't know that at all. Right? Now this impulse comes. The impulse comes, we have to try to have a God which is somewhat like the God of Christianity. We know something about Christ. We know something about Muhammad. We even know something about the Buddha. We know that the Buddha was born in, let's say, 526 BC, right? But what do we know about Ram? We know nothing. We don't know where he was born. And the reason you don't is because there has never been any necessity felt among Hindus to historicize their religion, to historicize their gods, right? So in fact, these Hindu nationalists came along and said, they consulted the astrologers. And the astrologer said, Ram was born in 7,243 BC at 3:12 a.m. That's a bunch of, if I may use the word, baloney. Okay? Because the question here is, why do you need to do that? You don't need to do it. The religion is sufficiently elastic, flexible. It is much more interested in the world of myth than in the world of history. So that new element that has come in is this kind of idea that the way in which you become a rational people is you start to have a specific historical record of who you are, where you came from, what are your achievements. And when the British come to India, one of the things that they reach a conclusion about is they say, well, it's interesting. The Hindus have a great tradition of astronomy, philosophy, theology, all of which is true. Texts going back into remote antiquity. And they say the only thing that we cannot find that the Hindus ever produced was a historical literature. Right? I'm one of the few people, by the way, who completely agrees with that view. Completely agrees with that view, except that the real difference is they thought that was a huge deficiency. I think that's a huge strength of that particular faith. The fact that there was no historical sensibility of that kind. That has not been the weakness. That has been the strength of that faith. And what is happening here is an attempt to now transform Hinduism completely so that it begins to look very much like what? Its opposite, its enemy. So that it begins to look like Islam. So let's say, we can say now, okay, this is where Ram was born. We can say that Muhammad was born in such and such place, Mecca or Medina, right? He was born in such and such year. So now you say, we can say that Ram was born in Ayodhya, he was born in such and such year, this is his history, right? You see what's happening, right? The ascendancy of history, the transformation of Hinduism, a certain interpretation of the Indian past which focuses on these constructions of imagined wrongdoings, imagined or real wrongdoings. This is what the Muslims did to us. This is how we have to repay them now. Okay? We have to take back our history. You know, you hear that phrase very often in progressive movements here. We have to take back our history. I would say one has to be very cautious about this project of taking back our history, because that's what's being attempted over here. Right? And so now we have to look at this then in relationship to the idea of communalism. So I'm going to take the questions in a couple of minutes. Let me just summarize now. What we're saying is this. Okay? Let's put it in a capsule form. So communalism is the idea that you can understand history, or I should say the communalist interpretation of Indian history is that you can understand Indian history as a history primarily through the prism or lens of religion. And the communalist interpretation of Indian history says that if you go back to the past, it is very clear from the past down to the present day that the predominant category through which Indians have worked out their lives, worked out their social relationships, is the category of religion. In India, the next step of the argument is, in India, the two predominant religious communities are Hindus and Muslims. And these two religions cannot be reconciled together. They cannot inhabit the same place in equality. And so, in fact, the Hindu nationalist ideologues are very clear. They don't say, by the way, throw out all the Muslims. They say, let the Muslims stay in India. But let the Muslims stay in India with the awareness that they are going to be second-class citizens. Right? And they'll say, by the way, that's a lot better than Muslim countries because they won't even let the Hindus stay there. They're very clear about that. So they'll say, look at Saudi Arabia. You can't even be a citizen of Saudi Arabia if you are a Hindu. Right? So they'll say that. They'll say, well, you know, what's the problem here? This is a much more generous view. We're not saying to the Muslims, don't leave the country. We're saying, understand that because these two religions cannot inhabit the same space and equality, therefore it means that you must accept your second-class citizenship. And in fact, actually, the Hindu nationalist view has several different trajectories, because some Hindu nationalists argue that it's in fact the Hindus who have second-class status, not the Muslims in India. That's another part of the argument, right? Some of them will say, well, actually, the reason why Hindus have a second-class status is because Muslims are a minority, and therefore the government is always trying to appease the minority. It's electoral politics. You want to get the minorities' vote, right? Affirmative action for the minorities, etc., etc., etc. So the Hindu nationalist strand has several different parts to it as well. We're not looking at all of them, but this is really how the chips fall, if I may put it this way. Right? And so I'm saying to you that if you're looking at Hindu-Muslim relations, then you can see that there are several different things one would have to consider. One would have to consider the nature of the past. How does one interpret the past? How does one understand the relationship between these two people over a long period of time? Does one use the category of history? Because I'm suggesting to you that one of the things that has happened is the ascendancy of the historical way of thinking. And I'm saying that has been a calamity for India, a calamity in many ways, right? And this is, of course, contradictory to the common received view that, I mean, for example, if you look at writings in America, a lot of American commentators will tell you the problem with the US is that we don't have a sense of history here, right? Well, I think you have to go to India to understand what it means not to have a sense of history, right? Okay? So this is part of a comprehensive understanding of the transformation not only of Hindu-Muslim relations and understanding of the past, but the transformation of Hinduism itself. And of course, that transformation has not been completed. It's not completely successful. I mean, if it were completely successful, then we would say that the Hindu nationalist view would have triumphed in every way. So part of the battle that is taking place in India now, if I may put it this way, is between precisely those who espouse the Hindu nationalist view and those who say, whether they're secular or not, those who say that, well, this is not the only way to understand not only the past, but to understand the nature of Hindu-Muslim relations in India today, right? There are ways in which one could argue, and that is what I have argued in my article, that in fact the secular view in some ways resembles the communal view. In some ways, of course, it's diametrically opposed. But one of the ways in which it resembles the communal view is in its reliance upon the category of history. Because what do the secularists do? They say to the communalists, we have a better history than you. Our understanding of the past is based in a better history. And I'm suggesting to you that history is the problem, in part. That so long as you base your understanding on history, okay, you're going to run into the kinds of problems we run into now. All right, I think you had a question.
Yes, were Hindus treated as second-class citizens under other Muslim rulers besides, say,
That's a long question, right? I mean, in other words, we would have to look at the nature of particular Muslim dynasties, particular kingdoms. So, okay, if you are looking at the Mughals, so we're taking a later period now. We're not looking at the Delhi Sultanate, the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. We're looking at the period from 1526 onwards. So Akbar, one of Akbar's successors, eventual successors, because, you know, you got Jahangir, his son, then Jahangir is going to be followed by Shah Jahan, and then Shah Jahan is going to be followed by Aurangzeb. In Indian history, the contrast is always between Akbar versus Aurangzeb. Because Aurangzeb is supposed to have been bigoted and intolerant to the same degree to which Akbar is supposed to have been very tolerant. Right? And so what happened to the Hindus under Aurangzeb? The common narrative. I'm saying the common narrative. And you remember that I had put the common narrative of what happened under Akbar into question too, because I said, all right, let's supposing that all of this happened under Akbar. Yeah, he married a Hindu wife. That we know he did. We know that he was very generous and tolerant, all of that. But what does this tell us about Hindu-Muslim relationships at the village? What do we know about that? We cannot extrapolate from what Akbar did and say, well, that tells us something about the nature of relations between Hindus and Muslims in everyday life. Right? Now, similarly, Aurangzeb, it is very clear, had an extreme intolerance towards Hindus. No question about it. Okay? And you know, you can see that in various ways. So some people will argue that one of the ways in which you can see it is the imposition of the Sharia or the jizya. The jizya is a poll tax. So it's a head tax. That is, for every person pays a tax, but every person who is a non-believer, which meant that the Hindus had to bear a larger share of the taxes than the Muslims. Right? There are also stories about the destruction of Hindu temples under Aurangzeb. On the other hand, by the way, we know that Aurangzeb also conferred land grants on Hindu temples. That is, that there's some cases where he actually conferred a grant of land to a temple board for the construction of a temple. Right? So there's a little bit of, you know, a gray area there if you're really looking at it. But the answer to your question is that I think it's very clear that under certain Muslim rulers, there's no question that the Hindus would have felt oppressed. But clearly that is not the case with every Muslim ruler. And you can also say, now this is another way to look at it, under secular rule, Hindus and Muslims might feel oppressed too. If you're a Dalit living in India today, you're not living under a Hindu rule or under Muslim rule, but you might still feel oppressed. So the nature of that oppression may have to do with class. It may have to do with class as well. It may have to do with a great many other things other than religion. Yeah.
Were Hindus and Muslims treated differently under colonialism?
That depends on the particular period that you're looking at. Very good question. For example, after 1857, why 1857? Because you have a big rebellion that takes place. It's called the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58. The British view was that this rebellion, which was the greatest threat to their rule, since they had established themselves 100 years ago, their view was that this is the work largely of Muslims. And so, once they crushed the rebellion, they made sure that Muslims would receive a larger proportion of the blame and punishment. And that had consequences for Muslims for at least 2-3 generations, I would say. Right? Right? So the answer to the question is yes. After 1857, I think it's absolutely true that in certain parts of India, the Hindus and Muslims were treated differently. But when the Indian nationalist movement arises, then the tables turn, because they see the they see the Indian nationalist movement led by basically upper caste Hindu leaders. Now they're trying to suppress that. They're going to take the help of the Muslims now, right? So it's a different story at that point in time. Any other questions about anything having to do with communalism, the attempted transformation of Hinduism, if I may put it this way, okay? The question of and the interpretation of the Indian past, all of that, right? Yeah. Multiple Hindu nationalist groups, that's a question, right? Well, look, I mean, anything like Hindu nationalism or any phenomenon of that sort, including Islamic nationalism or extremism, it's always a hydra-headed monster, if I may put it this way. It has various different branches, right? But the real substance of the question is, was there a disagreement among Hindu nationalists about how to tackle, for example, the whole situation of the Ram Janambhoomi? Okay, I haven't told you the outcome yet. I will tell you that in a moment. Okay, and the answer to that question is not really. There are some differences between the VHP, okay, and the BJP and the RSS. What are the VHP, the RSS, the BJP? It can be explained in very simple terms. Okay, so the VHP, you don't have to write out the whole thing. You'll see that in the readings you have. The VHP is the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. Okay. If you had to translate it into English, roughly it would be something like the World Council of Hindus, something like that. Okay. Then you have an organization called the BJP. But the BJP is not just an organization, it's a political party. Bharatiya Janata Party. So Bharatiya is standing for India, Janata means the common people. Okay, right? The Bharatiya Janata Party, it's a political party. It sits in parliament. So it's like the Congress, or in the US it would be like the Democrats, Republicans, right? Okay, right? It sits in, and in fact, until Manmohan Singh and the UPA came into power several years ago, the BJP was part of the ruling alliance that governed India, right? The principal party in the ruling alliance. And then you have an organization called the RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which can be translated roughly as the National Volunteer Corps. Okay? So what is the division of labor between these three? There are other Hindu organizations too. What is the division of labor? In some ways, very simple. Of course, some overlapping between the three in the division of labor. But by and large, the division of labor is pretty clear. The BJP is the political party. So it's the political front of the Hindu nationalist movement. It's the one that represents the Hindu nationalists in parliament or in government, if it forms a majority. The VHP does the cultural work of the Hindu nationalists. Cultural work means propagation of Hindu culture, propagation of the great Indian past, the glorious texts of the Vedas or the Upanishads or the Mahabharata, right? Promotion of Indian dance, right? All of that. Sounds kind of innocent, well-meaning. Some of it is innocent, some of it is well-meaning, no doubt about it. But of course it's not simply that, because the VHP also tries to push for a certain interpretation of Hinduism. And what interpretation of Hinduism? Precisely of the kind that I was talking about before, right? VHP is very, very unsettled. These are all ultra-Hindu groups. And the only thing they don't like is practicing Hindus, if I may put it ironically. Why? Because in the practice of Hinduism, it's just complete chaos, right? Hundreds and thousands of gods, different ways of worshipping, right? I mean, they would like some kind of regularity and uniformity, if I may put it this way. Okay? And so the VHP tries to push a certain evangelical Protestant idea of Hinduism, if I may put it this way. Okay? Proselytization, which is not historically a part of the Hindu faith at all. Hinduism is one religion that, I think that's accurate to say that, right? That Hinduism is not, historically speaking, a religion that has tried to convert people. There's no history of proselytization at all, right? The VHP is interested in that sort of thing. In fact, one of the things that it actively promotes is reconversion of Muslims back into the Hindu faith. Shuddhi. Or parivartan. Parivartan is homecoming. You know, homecoming. You come back to what was your home. Right? So the VHP is engaged in all of that as well, but also, as I said, promotion of Indian dance, culture, etc., etc., etc. Right? The RSS, what does it do? What is its part in the division of labor? It does the muscle work of Hinduism. Right? You want to send out goons into the street. You know, you want to create a riot somewhere. Right? You want to create a political disturbance. Right? Use the RSS. And like all organization of this kind, it also does exceedingly legitimate work. So remember the English translation, National Volunteer Corps. Sounds like this Peace Corps that Kennedy set out, right? And that Obama is now trying to, you know, multiply it by a factor of 4 or whatever, right? You know, send out volunteers, you know, do good social work. So whenever you have a natural calamity in India, right, an earthquake took place in Gujarat, who do you think came there first, the Indian state or the RSS? The RSS. It comes there. It'll come with blankets, medicines, you know, help people. We also know, by the way, that in Gujarat, I mean, a lot of the Hindus will not admit it, but this has absolutely been verified. I can tell you that. When the Gujarat earthquake took place, the RSS, in many cases, would not help Muslim victims of the earthquake. If they found out that the person under the rubble was a Muslim, forget it. You know, it is sectarian, completely sectarian. And you have to remember that for all of these organizations, there is a counterpart on the Muslim side. For sure. Absolutely. I mean, communalism doesn't come only from one side. The only reason that we have to be more concerned about Hindu communalism is because Hindu communalism is the communalism of the majority. They're the ones poised to take political power, not the Muslim communalists. Right? There's communalism on the Muslim side too. No question about it. And India, of course, is in this position where, because of the enormous instability in Pakistan and Afghanistan and the so-called terrorist attacks that have taken place, that this is a pressing problem in India. No question about it. Right? Because to some extent, I'm also saying to you, okay, and I want to make this distinction now, a crucial distinction. And that's why sometimes I use these ironical phrases. And those ironical phrases, such as I said that, well, the VHP, you know, these are all ultra-Hindu organizations, and yet they are unsettled by Hinduism. They're uncomfortable with that faith, the very faith that they champion to the extreme. What is this distinction that you have to keep in mind? That these organizations are organizations which make a distinction between religion as faith and religion as ideology. These people are not really interested in religion as faith. For them, religion is an ideology. If it is an ideology, it means that you instrumentalize religion. When religion serves your purposes for politics, you embrace it. When it becomes a liability, you drop it like a hot potato. That is the nature of these movements. I think it's truer, by the way, for them than it is for the Muslim groups. So that we have another problem there, which maybe in week 10 we'll get to. But certainly for these groups, I think it is safe to say, I mean, and this is an interpretation I'm putting forward for you, that their commitment to Hinduism is only the commitment to the instrumentalization of the religion. Okay? Inwardly, a lot of them despise their own faith. Because, as I said, they see it as chaotic, unorganized, right? All of the things that, in my reading, have been the great strengths of that religion. The thing that make Hinduism stand out and say it's a very different religion than any other. Right? And from their point of view, those are the weaknesses of that faith. Okay? So this is going to be an important consideration when we try to look at the nature of Hindu-Muslim relations, how religion is used in the public sphere. Because what is this all about? It's about the use of religion in the public sphere. Okay, right? And I have to tell you the conclusion to the Ram Janambhoomi movement, which you already know because I've already said to you that the mosque was destroyed, but you don't know the exact circumstances. And this is where we have not looked at one question which we're going to resume my lecture on Tuesday with, that is the relationship between the state and culture and religion, right? Because what happens, this mosque is going to be destroyed literally with bare hands. 20,000 people are going to climb up on the mosque. If you look at the photographs, you can find them on Google all over, okay? And they're going to literally destroy it brick by brick with their bare hands with picks and shovels and axes and reduce it to absolute rubble. And what is the Indian state doing? Looking at this happening. Literally looking, by the way. I mean, there was police all around. It's not like the police are on a tea break, which they very often are in India. I mean, there are about 10 tea breaks in a day, you know, right? Especially in government offices, right? They're actually literally standing around looking at this happening. Why? They're looking at this happening because the complicity of the state. The complicity of the state. The Supreme Court of India had passed an order months before the destruction took place, saying that this could not be touched. By the way, what was this? It was not called the mosque. You see, the Supreme Court cannot call it a mosque because if it calls it a mosque, it has accepted the Muslim version of the story. If it says that it is a Ram Janamsthan, it has accepted the Hindu nationalist version. So what did the government call it? That's what lawyers are for. You can always get a lawyer to do anything under the sun, right? And the lawyers came forward and said, let's call it, quote, a disputed structure. So that's what it was. It was a disputed structure, right? So the Supreme Court passed an order saying this is a disputed structure. Nobody should tamper with it, right? Months before, and the obligation of the state is to follow the rules of the Supreme Court in this country as well. If the Supreme Court stipulates something, obligation. The executive has to enforce, right? What the judiciary, the highest level of the judiciary has ruled. Because the highest level of the judiciary ruling is equivalent to a constitutional ruling, if I may put it this way, right? And this ruling is passed and the mosque is destroyed with their hands. And then you're going to have repercussions because there's going to be obviously riots between Hindus and Muslims, and people are going to be killed in parts of the country, right? But you can read that in some of the readings that you have. All right, we're going to stop over here, and let me give you a very, very gentle reminder of your obligation for the following Tuesday, which is to have a paper from